If everyone could take a seat, we'll be beginning shortly. Thank you.
Can everybody please take a seat and we're going to get started. And those of you way in the back, we'll pick on you if you don't move up to the front. So come on up. We'll ask you all the tough questions. Oh, okay. Well, good evening and welcome to the Minneapolis Climate Action Plan Kickoff event. This has been a long time coming, and it's wonderful to have you all here. I'm Gail Prest. I'm the Sustainability Director for the City of Minneapolis, a very lucky job, I know, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Before we get started, we just got a few housekeeping things. Number one is we need to thank the Central Library for letting us be in this beautiful space that's energy efficient, and it's easy to get to by bike, walk, or bus. So thank you very much, Central Library. And then just to set up this event a little bit, I know a lot of you know each other and a lot of you are more expert on this subject than I am, but what we wanted to do today is to build a compelling case as to why we're embarking on the Climate Action Plan. We're going to be talking about what the science is telling us about climate change here in Minneapolis, here in Minnesota. We're going to be talking about the public health impacts of it. We're going to actually then get more focused on Minneapolis. We've been doing some work over the last 4 months, and we know what our greenhouse gas emissions are for the city. We'll go over that data with you and some breakdowns, and then talk about what the heck is a climate action plan, and what's our process? How can the public be involved? How long will it take? And there'll be a little bit of time left over, so do not leave for a quick exercise. We're going to be asking you for your opinions. It's kind of secretive, so you don't have to get embarrassed. I know Minnesotans, we don't always like to brag about what we know, so it'll be a quick process. But anyway, there'll be time for Q&A after most of the speakers, but it's jam-packed, and I just really appreciate you all being here. So with that, let's get started. It's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Mayor Rybak. As most of you know, he is indeed a national leader on environmental issues, and I will say personally, I know that he is very supportive of staff, and he pushes us often beyond our comfort level when it comes to environmental issues, and I'm very, very lucky to have you leading the charge, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Gail. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Could we give a hand to Gail and her staff and Stephen Bosacker, our city coordinator, and everybody who's done so much. Thank you for bringing us all together. I love that introduction, Gail, about Minnesotans who are shy about making their views known. Welcome to the one Minnesotan who does not have that problem. Really, really great to see this amazing turnout, and it's great to sort of look around the room for me because I see a lot of folks who I met 10 years ago when I was running for mayor and said, let's really go in and deal with sustainability, but let's first off try to explain that to people, which took about 8 years. But it's really great to see that. But it's also really great to meet other people who've been part of it. I just met a wonderful Rafe who's moved here from San Francisco 2 years ago, lives a couple blocks away, is really passionate about it. What an amazing city we have that's attracted so many folks. And while I'm really proud of the leadership we've had at City Hall, the followers in this room are the political leaders. You must, in this community, if you have your ear to the ground, recognize that the real momentum here is from an amazing civic infrastructure of people who care about our community. And people who can really say that we should not be really good at this. We should not be one of the best. There is no excuse for Minneapolis to not be leading the way in all of this work. Not a single excuse in the world. I am not satisfied unless we are leading on every one of these indicators. And no one in this room should be. You know that old saying about somebody who was born on third and think they hit a triple? That's Minneapolis with the environment and sustainability. We deserve to be in the lead. You know, I picked up the paper this morning. I just got this great news. I'm a gardener, so I was so excited. I realized that from this whole chart that they did that, wow, isn't this great? That Minneapolis is now in a new zone where you can grow a lot more. I thought that's just great. Then I read this book last year, and it was all about the impacts of the climate crisis, and it was talking about the fact that as the polar ice cap melts, that there will be less of this cold mass over the Hudson Bay. Mark Seeley will probably say this is all full of water or whatever it is. But this whole theory was, gee, that's so great because it means, you know how when you're looking at the temperature and you see that it's even across the country, but there's this big dip in the center, and that's us? Well, that won't be as much. It won't be as cold in the winter. I thought, what great news. Well, what's the consequence of that? Oh, I don't know, a quarter of the planet going underwater, about food systems being disrupted. It's time to put the crisis back in climate crisis. This is a crisis. We have to move now. And so it's absolutely important. This is not our climate plan. This is not our climate study document. This is not our climate consulting, whatever, this or that. This is our climate action plan, and it's about action. And it's not starting from zero. People in this room for really decades, some of you have been working on this work. Those of us in the city have had a sustainability plan for a decade. The green print is part of that. The work we've done on converting our fleet, including my plug-in hybrid. The work we've done on land use patterns that concentrates growth along transit corridors to make us more compact and have less fuel. The work we've done to make our buildings green, including the green roof on this building. I could go on and on about it. We have done some remarkable things, but we've also been pioneers in a couple places that I think are absolutely pivotal to this work. And I believe one of the great environmental issues of our time is food. And the issue of homegrown Minneapolis, which really recognizes that carbon arrives on your dinner table every single night from a food system that is oil-based and disconnected from those who grow it. That's wrong. We're a food city. We got here because we became the milling capital of the world. We will sustain ourselves by reconnecting with the farms. Homegrown Minneapolis is pioneering work that many people have been involved with. And as long as I'm mayor, Homegrown Minneapolis is going to be one of the most important initiatives we have. There's much, much more on what we're doing with our water, on what we're doing with our land. It's incredibly important work. But what we need to do today is to come to the community with what we are doing, feedback what you think of what we're doing, and push us to not settle for anything less than really making sure that we are really, really moving the dial on this. So what we're going to do is to bring out what we've been doing, have you give us some input, but we also don't just say, gee, let's do this every few years and give us some more ideas. The reason that we succeed on some of these initiatives, and frankly the reason that we fail on others, is really dependent a lot on whether we're in a partnership with people out in the community doing the work. So please stick with us, please push us, but please, the only thing I ask you not to do is to go away. Please don't go away. Please be our partners in all of this. And as we move forward, we need to think about some of the big questions we have and not always take the simple way out, not always go with conventional wisdom. You know, I was talking to Tom Braun here and some of the great leaders in Linden Hills who've done remarkable work on really looking at composting and what we're doing with organics. But I began to think over these past couple of years as we've looked at it and made such great progress in Linden Hills, is the greenest strategy for us to have door-to-door composting throughout the city, which would be, door-to-door organic collection throughout the city, which would be really cool, but then we have these trucks going to every block of the city, or should we try to heal more with composting in our neighborhoods? That's a big trade-off. That's what we need you to help us think about. What is the conventional wisdom that we should change about it? When we look at energy policy, it's not always a given that only the issues like solar and wind are going to get us to where we need to be. So what is the next piece of that? So challenge conventional wisdom, stay with us, and more than anything else, take pride in the fact that we have a very green city, but we have a long way to go, and we're not satisfied till we're there. Thank you very much for all your work. I look forward to what happens and putting it into action. And back to Gail. Thank you, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, the mayor didn't brag that he was one of the first 10 mayors in the country to sign the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Agreement, a bold action that eventually led to over 1,000 mayors signing, but as being one of the first, it made it easier for others to follow. Well, let's get started with our first speaker. I'd like to do an introduction for Dr. Mark Seeley. Dr. Seeley is a climatologist and tenured professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at our University of Minnesota. When you listen to him, he's a regular commentator on Minnesota Public Radio, and you'll recognize the voice. And he coordinates the weather and climate education programs with the National Weather Service and the Minnesota State Climatology Office. He is an author of Minnesota Weather Almanac, a 200-year history of weather in the state, and also he's a co-author of Voyager Skies, Weather and Wilderness in Minnesota's National Park. And that book is just gorgeous. It's beautiful pictures of Voyager along with Dr. Seeley's comments on the climate and weather and what he's seen. He's been awarded numerous different awards, including the Sigma Chi Science Communication and Education Award, an award by MnDOT on research partnership for his work with the deployment of living snow fences, and most recently with the University of Minnesota Extension Director's Award for Distinguished Faculty. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Seeley. We'll have time at the end for about 10 minutes of questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight, and I've got a fairly heady task here to go through what our Minnesota climate history teaches us, and especially related to the theme for this evening in terms of a climate action plan. So I'll proceed through this with some pace. If you have questions, though, and that you don't want to save till the end, by all means, go ahead and ask them as we go. First and foremost, I like to highlight something from a very eminent climate scientist, Dr. Stan Chagnon from Illinois, who was our first Keenest Endowment lecturer many years ago. And it's just a graphical depiction of how we as human beings perceive climate behavior on the planet we live on. There's 4 distinct views of how we perceive the climate behavior on the planet. There's the stationary view, which goes back to the Thomas Jefferson, the Founding Fathers days, which is premised on the notion that, graphically speaking, if you measure a climate attribute at a point on Earth for enough years, you got it. You measure enough decades, you got its central tendency, you have its annual variability, you have its extremes, you know everything there is to know about it. And that was the premise that our country was founded on. That's why they, even from Founding Fathers days, we were such advocates of measuring the climate all over the country and keeping very good records. Bear in mind, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, all these people were very keen weather observers. Another view of climate behavior, how climate behaves, is the cyclical view, which suggests that the climate of planet Earth behaves in certain cyclical manner. There's dual wet seasons, for example, the classic bi-rainy climates of the subtropical areas of the world. Or there's hot and cold cycles and things of this nature. We don't commonly think about cyclical behavior of climate here in Minnesota because, quite frankly, we can't find any evidence of such. But there are countries in the world, notably the equatorial countries, where climate behaves in such regular cycles that the weather services of those countries can use those cycles as predictors for their seasonal outlooks and things like that. So there is relevance, but there's geographic relevance for this view of cyclical behavior. A third view of climate behavior is a modification of the stationary view, which acknowledges that if we measure climate at a point on Earth for a long enough period of time, we can describe certainly the central tendencies, and one thing we have to acknowledge is that the variation about the central tendencies might wax and wane. And boy, do we have ample evidence for this in Minnesota, where one year was different than the next, and different than the next, and different than the next. It was like we were getting a new roll of the dice every year on climate behavior. And then we've also gone through some years where it seems like we were stuck in a rut, and one year behaved like the previous year, and we didn't see much variation. So the variability view has relevance for us here in Minnesota. And then the fourth view of climate behavior is the trend shift view, which is premised on the notion that the statistical behavior of a climate attribute, like precipitation or temperature, for example, will stay within certain statistical bounds as long as that place on Earth is undisturbed. But when there's a disturbance, when you urbanize a landscape, when you dam a major river, when you take out a forest, when you clear the forest, or destroy a wetland, or any number of other things, you perturb the landscape, and in perturbing the landscape, you perturb its interaction with the overlying atmosphere, and you start to measure statistical attributes that are outside the bounds of what you've measured historically. And so there's ample evidence that in the mode of climate change, we have this going on at a number of places around the world, and in fact we have it going on in our own backyard here in Minnesota. So each of these views has some validity in our statistics of the measured attributes of the Earth climate system, but please bear in mind, for purposes of this conversation tonight, an argument can be made that our American infrastructure has been founded on the stationary view of climate behavior. Our electric utility grid, our freshwater supply system, our interstate transportation system, our architecture, a number of things related to the infrastructure around us were originally premised on a stationary view of climate behavior. There's also the notion that we have to deal with in terms of vulnerability. Years ago, we had a professor come to the university and lecture us on whether we were mitigating our societal vulnerability to individual weather events and climate episodes. And the frank answer was, we're not. In fact, we could make arguments that we're even more vulnerable than we once were. If we believe the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration statistics that they compile each year with the help of the insurance industries in this country, and we look at the time trajectory here of economic losses, both insured and uninsured, due to individual weather events, landfall, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc., or episodes like droughts and wildfires, we find that in terms of the economic consequence, it sure looks to me like the trend is upward, not downward. And in fact, since 1980, we've compiled losses totaling over $1.8 trillion in this country, just due to individual weather events and climate episodes. And that's a big bill. I don't know, I don't know if some of you are aware of this, but since 1980, the insurance underwriting industry in our country has had to be reorganized twice to survive as a result of this scale of losses. Now, what drives climate behavior? Categorically, in the climate science community, there's widespread agreement that there are three categorical drivers of climate behavior. There's, of course, all the natural variation, and that's existed as long as the planet Earth has existed. It's about geometry with the sun. It's about solar flux from the sun. It's about the waxing and waning in our ice sheets and the ocean currents and volcanic eruptions and a whole bunch of other things. Been in play for 4.5 billion years and is still in play today. But we also have two other categories that drive climate behavior, and that is our disturbance of the landscape, both the landscapes we occupy and the landscapes we exploit. And that continues to go on today, and that produces measurable changes in climate attributes. And then the changing composition of the Earth's atmosphere, which is another factor that drives climate behavior, that in composite, all three of these dictate some of the measured attributes in the Earth climate system. Now, why believe that they're changing? Why believe that climate change is real? I'd like to make 3 points about that. We have 3 independently derived global data sets that show that the measured attributes of the Earth climate system are changing. So we're not relying on one data set. We have 3 independent data sets that say the same thing. And it's not changing uniformly. I mean, there's geographic disparity in some parts of the globe they're changing more dramatically than in others, but nevertheless change is prevalent in these data sets. There's no question about it. Secondly, the climate models used today to mimic the behavior of the Earth climate system, the models that are used to fit the measurements that we make, behave with greater accuracy if we parameterize our human fingerprints, if we parameterize what we've done to the landscape and the landscape change, and if we parameterize what we've done to the atmosphere and the atmospheric composition change. They fit what's happening in the measurements better. Strong empirical evidence that the human fingerprint is embedded in the signal. And then lastly, a very rapidly building body of evidence that should not be discounted. In fact, this may play out to be a huge chapter in the next IPCC report, is simply that there are physical and biological changes going on in the world's ecosystems that are being measured, and they're absolutely logical results of the changes in climate attributes. So they're tied in with the measured changes in climate attributes. So taken as a whole, there's 3 good reasons to believe that climate change is real. On all continents, the IPCC reports, on all continents, the global climate models fit the measured behavior of climate if the human fingerprint is parameterized, if the change in landscape is accounted for and the change in atmospheric composition is accounted for. That was really emphasized in their last report. And they're continuing to work on different ways to express this. The composite result of that for us here in Minnesota is depicted in this graphic that our former state climatologist Jim Zandlow generated. And suffice that the composite of the climate models, given one of the common scenarios used for the future, shows that the 44-degree isotherm, mean annual temperature that runs through central Minnesota and the Twin Cities today, will be at International Falls by 2070. So the behavior of temperature associated with a 44-degree isotherm will have migrated about 250 miles north to International Falls by 2050, according to the output of those climate models. Widely acknowledged among the regional climate scientists in our western Great Lakes region are the changing attributes of temperature, water vapor, and precipitation. And these changes are showing up in the measurements. I'll show you how they're showing up in the new so-called normals that were released last summer, the new climate normals. Our temperature signal is upward. It's more profoundly upward in the winter, and it's more profoundly upward in the overnight minimum than the daytime maximum. Our dew points, we're seeing increased tropical-like atmospheric water vapor episodes in our region, one of which was last July. I don't know how many of you remember last July 19th, but we had heat index values between 105 and 134 across the state. And then the precipitation signal is showing greater variability. In general, we're seeing a larger fractional contribution from thunderstorms to our annual precipitation. And I'll show you some examples of that. Here's the Minnesota temperature record from our Minnesota State Climate Office. This is the pooled data from all our cooperative weather observers in the state. By the way, we're a very blessed state to have hundreds upon hundreds of volunteer weather observers that take daily collections of measurements for us. But you can see all the way back to the late 19th century, here it's smoothed with a running mean, the relative periods where the annual mean was cool, relative periods where the annual mean was warm, and you can see in the recent decades, the signal in the mean annual temperature is clearly persistently warm, and in amplitude it is significantly warm as well. Hidden in that signal is a seasonality disparity. The seasonality disparity shows up here in that the winter months, the northern hemisphere winter of December through February, the signal is of a greater amplitude and more persistence than it is in the spring or the fall or the summer. This is true for a lot of mid-latitude locations. This isn't just true for Minnesota. This is true if you look at the temperature signal and its change in, say, Central Asia or some European nations as well. You'll see this kind of disparity show up. We can see it also show up when we analyze the temperature signal embedded in the heating season in Minnesota, when we have to heat our buildings. And here's the most recent 14 heating seasons, November through March, a reflection of the composite average temperature across the state and its historical rank back to 1895. And you can see of the 14 recent ones, we've only had 1, 2, 3, 4 show up in the cold part of the historical distribution, and the other 10 are clearly in the warm part of the historical distribution. So we've very much had a skewed distribution of temperature relative to our heating seasons in Minnesota. We also look at the disparity between what's happened to daytime maximum temperatures and nighttime minimum temperatures, and we see that some of the nighttime temperature, average temperatures, are changing very significantly, not in fractions of a degree, but whole degrees. Look what's happened to the minimums at Rochester, Minnesota, as we've migrated through time. January's changed from 1.9 back in the middle of the 20th century to 7.7. February's gone from 7.6 to 12.4. March 19.2 to 24.3. These are pretty large-scale changes. We look at central Minnesota, Collegeville. Look what's happened to the average minimum temperatures again. The migration upward in the new normals period is pretty evident in some of these data. This is wider in scale, wider in scope than just Minnesota. This last summer, the National Climatic Data Center released how the new normals period of 1981 to 2010 differed from the previous normals period of 1971 to 2000. And a couple of examples. Here's the July maximum temperature. So here we're talking about the height of summer, and we're talking about the daytime maximum temperature across the U.S. Cooperative Weather Observer Network. And the net change depicted in red is positive, depicted in blue is negative. So we can see western U.S., the new normals for July maximum are generally of a higher value than the older ones. Same thing in some of the mid-Atlantic states. But in much of the central U.S., they're static or they're lower than what they were for the previous period. Whereas if we look at January minimum temperature and how that changed across the country, almost everywhere in the country has seen a rise in the January minimum temperature, according to the new reference normals, which are frame of reference now. So whenever we refer to what's average for a place, we're referring to these new normals, and we have to recognize that they're migrating upward. They're of greater value. Here's a change in all of the monthly mean values depicted at one of our southern Minnesota locations, Waseca, Minnesota, and you can see that 11 of the 12 monthly mean values were upward. Only the month of May remained flat. The other 11 are all on an upward trajectory. Here we look at Chaska, one of our metro area stations. And what's interesting here is I've compared the change in normals from 71 to 2000 to 81 to 2010 in the monthly minimum, the monthly maximum, and the monthly mean. And what's striking here where I've highlighted is the amplitude of change. The measure of the amplitude of change is strongest over here in the minimum temperature column. You can see that that's where the signal is showing up here. And it's no wonder, Mayor Ryback, that we see that a big headline item this winter was a change in the plant hardiness zones that come out, so that now they're suggesting that here in the Twin Cities we have Zone 4B and even Zone 5A present on the Minnesota landscape because of these changes that are going on in the temperature. So these measured climate attributes are statistically showing up in our state database to be rather significant changes. I've shown you examples of what the data look like. How about the consequence of those changes? We're also starting to see consequence in terms of a shorter period our soils and lakes are frozen, more rapid breakdown of our farmers' crop residues that are left in the field, later fall nitrogen applications because soil temperatures are remaining so warm, fewer adverse weather days for the construction industry, change in the biological survival rates of organisms during the Minnesota winter, not quite as high a mortality for some of them that has occurred in the past, reduced heating degree days, not quite as many heating degree days as those days of old. However, a large number of freeze-thaw cycles. We're flirting with the 32-degree mark much more frequently during winter than we once did. And that doesn't do our roads and sidewalks and parking lots much good. In fact, the trend in what we have to pay for the maintenance is going in the wrong direction relative to that. Change in animal migration, hibernation and foraging behaviors. Lots of things going on in terms of that. We can talk about bird migrations and other kinds of things. And then from a healthcare consequence, which you're going to hear from Kristen later, is patient loads. Patient loads, especially for those that suffer from molds and allergens, because the season is being extended. It's lasting longer than it once did. Here's a depiction of the summer temperature, kind of a modest warming signal in the summer months of June, July, August. Here's a depiction of the last 19 air conditioning seasons, May through September, when we typically have to run air conditioning. And again, going back and looking at the statewide number, the calculated statewide average, and then where it ranks historically. Of the last 19, we've only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fall in the cold part of the historical distribution. All the others have been in the warmer part, and we've had some rather extreme ones. This last May through September ranked 5th historically. That's how warm it was. And here we see the long-term frequency distribution for number of 90-degree days in the Twin Cities area. And we all remember what 1988 was like, day after day after day after day. But since that time, we've seen numbers tail off, clearly since 1988. We have seen more frequent intrusions of tropical-like dew points, where the dew point goes up to 70 degrees and makes us all feel very uncomfortable. We've not only seen this materialize in terms of trending the Twin Cities dew point record, but we also see this in looking at the frequency distribution as far north as Voyageurs National Park, up at Cabotogama Lake, where they've had these unbelievable numbers of hours with 70-degree dew points. And of course, that's a destination we all hope to escape heat by going up there. We don't want to run into it up there. The dew point, from the standpoint of atmospheric behavior, the dew point sets the floor for the overnight minimum temperature. The dew point sets the floor, how low the overnight air is going to cool. Because once it cools down in the stratified layers that it compresses into overnight, when it hits the dew point, the water vapor condenses out, releases the latent heat, and the temperature stabilizes. And so you would expect as a logical conclusion that with a higher frequency of intrusion of tropical-like air masses, we should see some upward migration in some of our summer minimum temperatures. And indeed, we can see an upward migration in some of our summer minimum temperatures. We also see, unfortunately, an increased frequency distribution of when the National Weather Service has to issue heat advisories. And in fact, they have had to issue quite a few in recent summers. Their threshold or criteria here in Minnesota is 105. So when we have a high dew point, coincidental with an air temperature of 88, 89, 90, 91, 92 degrees, suddenly we have a heat index of 105 or 112 or 120. On July 19th of this last summer, we set new all-time state records at Moorhead up in the Red River Valley. They were an 88 dew point with 134 heat index. Those were the highest values on the North American continent at Moorhead, Minnesota. So you see that what's going on, and generationally, it kind of boggles the mind to think about this, because in my 200-year history of Minnesota weather that Gail referred to, I've documented all the historic heat waves in Minnesota, but all these earlier years were heat waves induced by high air temperature. That's when we have the records. The records stem from those years, where we had on the thermometer a reading of 112 or 110 or 114. But all these highlighted in red now are all dew point driven heat waves. Not because the ambient air temperature got so high, but because the heat index got so high because the outside air was laden with water vapor. So the stress from the heat wave today, same as the stress of the heat wave of old, except it's induced by water vapor and not by air temperature. This too has consequence. Biological organisms respond to these high water vapor contents, and some of those organisms thrive rather well. We see elevated water temperatures in our lakes because our inland lakes can't give up their heat to an overlying atmospheric layer that's already laden with water vapor. We see healthcare consequence in that segments of our population are hyper sensitive to high dew points, and so they may go into distress rather early on compared to normal healthy people. We see increased stress on our livestock sector. We see increased stress on our pets, for all that matter, because they too suffer when we have these extreme spells. And then we've really come to the point in this state where just about every new construction, even in the northernmost resort areas of Minnesota, formerly immune from dew point driven heat waves, are starting to have these temperatures. And if you're paying $2,000 a week to stay there, you certainly don't want to be up there sitting in front of a fan all day. So we're seeing a much more widespread use of air conditioning than what we've seen in our history. The third attribute is the precipitation one, which basically shows that the trend is upward. It's upward across much of the U.S. Certainly in the Great Lakes region, it's been upward. We see this in the graphic of our statewide precipitation signal, in that many of the more recent years have fallen above the 75th percentile. That's pretty clear in our data. We see this in the smoothing data set of all our data, in that we see both a persistence and an amplitude associated. Now, this is statewide depiction. This isn't for an individual location. We don't see quite the distinct seasonality. Winters have been mixed. Springs have generally been wet. Falls have generally been wet. Summers have been mixed. But nevertheless, the background normals have been changing. So here we see how the normal annual precipitation numbers have migrated to a higher value in recent decades. Some fairly significant. There's central Minnesota. Wilmer's up by 28%. Here's the Twin Cities, up by 20%. And the lakes area of central Minnesota is up by 23%. So we've seen quantity shifts upward in what we call average annual precipitation. And embedded in that quantity shift upward is this so-called character change I alluded to earlier, that a larger fraction of our precipitation is coming from thunderstorms. And in fact, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wrote about this in its last report to document all the landscape areas in the world's climates where a larger fraction of the annual precipitation is coming from thunderstorms. And in fact, we see this when we look at recurrence calculations for thunderstorm rainfalls, like 2-inch rainfalls, 3-inch rainfalls, 4-inch rainfalls. The frequencies are upward. In recent growing seasons, we've seen all these that are asterisked here. We have had our state climatology office report significant flash flooding and rather serious consequences from significant flash flooding in all those summers. And the lion's share of the summers have fallen in the wet part of the distribution. And Jim Zamlow, again, referring to my colleague that I really miss a lot. He was outstanding as our state climatologist. He put this together to show that since 2004, southeastern and south central Minnesota counties have experienced 3 1,000-year rainfalls. 3 1,000-year rainfalls in that area of the state since 2004. These are the 12, the 14, the 15-inch rainfall amounts from thunderstorm rains. And in fact, there's been a slight phase shift so that these heavy rains have been falling later on the calendar. The heaviest single dose of thunderstorm rain in the year, number of times has fallen in August, September, and even October in some years. Now, because thunderstorms infer high spatial variability, we tend to see the development across the Minnesota landscape in recent years of great disparity. We see areas that are getting huge surpluses of rain where the thunderstorms are passing over frequently. And then we see other areas of the state where they're getting missed. And so what we've seen since the summer of 2005 is we've seen that every summer, including this last summer, somewhere on the Minnesota landscape, severe to extreme drought has developed. Some areas have gotten missed. It's not always the same geographic area. It moves around. But since 2005, we've had some area of severe to extreme drought on the Minnesota landscape every summer. And in 2007, we had this anomaly. We had in August of 2007, 24 Minnesota counties declared federal disasters by the USDA and eligible for federal assistance because of drought, crop failures, declining aquifers, fire danger, water rationing, suspended irrigation permits, you name it. So they're eligible for federal assistance because of drought disaster. And in the same month, we had these 7 Minnesota counties declared by FEMA as federal flood disasters and eligible for federal flood recovery assistance. This is the one and only time, I call it a singularity because this is the one and only time I can find in Minnesota history that a snapshot in time we've had polar opposite federal disasters on the Minnesota landscape. But it is, when you think about it, a logical consequence of this huge thunderstorm character change. And if that plays out in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more repeated episodes of this. So there's also been response to this from the standpoint of more attention to sediment and runoff, storm sewer retrofits for storm sewer runoff systems, modified fisheries management by our DNR, mitigation of soil erosion, mitigation of flooding potential. Minnesota Association of Floodplain Managers has been quite active. So we see consequence playing out as a result of these changes in climate attributes. And then my last slide is, I use this generally because there is still a segment of our population that for one reason or another doesn't want to deal with this. But my message to you is not from a climate modeling perspective, but from a person who spent most of his life measuring things and then studying what the measurements show, that the measurements in our state, in our own backyard, are showing us that the climate is changing. And it's changing in significant ways. It's no longer grandma and grandpa's climate. It's giving us statistical behavior that in many respects is uniquely ours. And we have to adapt to it. And so if you fall in the category of waiting for rabbits or pigs to appear in the sky, I can verify that the Cloud Appreciation Society does document that rabbits and pigs do appear in the sky. And so it is, in my opinion at least, based on the statistical evidence, it should be an obvious conclusion that the climate behavior in the world around us is changing. Worrisome is that we have many things in place. We have infrastructure in place, we have behavior, lifestyle in place, we have a number of things in place that are imprinted by the stationary view of climate behavior, which is no longer valid. We're into a new era where the climate is behaving and the attributes we're measuring are statistically different than what we've seen in the past. And so we really need to give more serious discussion to this and think about what the implications are. And that's why, as a climate action group here, that's why this type of topic and the discussion generated from it is, in my opinion, a worthwhile endeavor. It is very, very much worth your time. So that's all I had to say. I hope I've even closed it out just 4 or 5 minutes early. Does anybody have a question or comment they'd like to make? Yes.
I was wondering, you didn't address soil levels. I'm curious how the soil levels, if you've paid attention to how much soil levels have dropped over history here. That's one.
You mean you're asking about soil? You're asking about soil moisture or soil per se?
Soil per se.
In terms of soil erosive losses and things. I'm sorry, I'm not up to speed on that, so I really don't know. There's lots of arguments being made, though, that especially in the modern context of this change in thunderstorm behavior, that we're seeing a lot more erosive events, but I don't know what the quantity translation of that is.
And I guess my second follow-up to that is, not that it's going to do everything in the world, but is there any possibility that if in a fantasy world everyone who lived here were able to convert their yards where there's just sod and very, very short grasses, if we all had rain gardens or yards that had deep-rooted plants in there where they're 15-foot roots, how much could that mitigate what's happening?
Oh boy, again, you're asking a question I haven't studied, so I don't know. You know, there are tremendous transformations in the Minnesota landscape, though, that have occurred, and these undoubtedly have had consequence. But going back, any modification we do now, I don't know how that would play out. There'd probably be, bear in mind, some of this is scale, so you might be able to measure, for example, some of the so-called efforts with rain gardens and things of that nature. You might be able to, if you had the instruments, you might be able to really measure some local effects. How those would translate into the broader scale, I'm not sure of. Yes?
You reassess what these normals are every so often. How come that is not being explained by our normal meteorologists? When we listen to television or whatever, they seem to be some of the hardest denialists because, well, everything is our normal high temperature for the season, but if that normal high temperature has been reassessed every 10 years and the high temperature you remember from your childhood is now significantly different than what you've got now, how come that is not being stressed to kind of convince everyone that this is real?
I mean, that's a very valid question. I'm aware of that criticism of our media weather folks, and in fact, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is trying to do something about that in conjunction with the American Meteorological Society in the following manner. They've developed in recent years a climate literacy curriculum that they're trying to get out to the meteorologists so that they better understand climate and climate behavior. it's barely getting started, so I don't know what its consequence is going to be. But bear in mind the other sort of psychological thing that's in play here is meteorologists are a different breed than a climatologist in that they have to devote much of their time to the here and now and what it means for tomorrow and next week. And they're getting tomorrow and next week so wrong so frequently that they're getting humiliated. And when you get humiliated routinely by the tools you use, you tend to distrust those tools when they're applied backward in time to try to assess climate behaviors. And that's actually a misconception, because actually the tools, there's reason to believe that some of the modern tools that we use to go back and reassess the past are better tools than we once had. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question, and maybe we'll get around to a better raising the climate literacy of these meteorologists in the future. Because the normals period, really, then if you ignore the normals period, what's going to happen is it's going to disguise, for the average citizen, it's going to disguise a lot of the change that's occurred across time, because the floor keeps changing. What you call normal keeps stepping up. And you can't ignore that. That's an important behavior in the climate system. Okay, I better,
Well, actually, I'm going to
yeah,
ask you about
okay.
Can you explain again about the winter night temperatures and its importance and implications? The question was if you could explain about the winter normals and how they're changing at nighttime and the implications, because I heard you
Yeah.
speak
Yeah.
the last time, and it was just astonishing how even when the temperature changes during a 24-hour period,
Yeah.
how important that is.
Well, I showed some of the measured consequences here. For example, I don't know, Kristen, are you going to talk about that a little bit? No, not particularly. I've had sessions with the U of M Med School this winter, as well as the Mayo Clinic. And for example, we've just gone through one of our mildest September through January periods in history. I mean, it's either like, well, for most communities, it's in the top 3. And this mold and allergen season was absolutely horrible. Their patient loads were unbelievable this year. And so there's a consequence of the, the fact that the temperatures, and the reason the temperatures have been staying so warm is the floor's not dropping at night. You know, we're having overnight lows in the 20s. We've even had some overnight lows in the 30s, which is crazy for us compared to, for example, on this date, give you an idea of Minnesota climate behavior on this date, February 1st. February 1st of 1878, we were in the high 30s to low 40s. The rest of the month stayed that way, and Minnesota farmers planted small grains in the month of February in 1878 because the soils were thawed, and they went out and just decided, well, let's see what happens. So they planted their wheat, barley, and oats in February of 1878. The one and only time in state history that we've planted crops in February. February 1st, 1915, it was snowing 18.5 inches in southern Minnesota on this date. Okay, 16 years later, February 1st, 1931, it was 60 on this date. 60 degrees. I suppose you could go out and do any number of things. Short sleeves, probably. And then February 1st, 1996, our lifetime in this room, minus 58 in northern Minnesota. So I mean, our culture is really, we've become very resilient and taken pride in how we've lived through all these things. But the fact that the minimums, another feature I didn't highlight that is relevant to your question, the fact that the general tendency of the minimums is to come up and the maximum temperatures kind of go up a little or remain flat, it's compressing the daily temperature range. And so if we really look at what we're living through compared to what Grandma and Grandpa lived through, on average, the daily temperature range is not as widespread as it once was historically, because we have this trend going on. So I don't know if that was a good enough answer, but anyway, those are some of the things that are happening with the data. So I think I'll step down and let Kristen Robb speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seeley. We're very fortunate in Minnesota to have you here with your immense knowledge and your willingness to speak time and time again to the public about this very important issue. So we've talked a little bit about what climate is telling us is happening in the state, and we're going to now talk about its impacts. Our next speaker, Kristen Robb, has a master's in landscape architecture and a master's in public health. She is the Climate Change Project Director for the Minnesota Department of Health, and she directs programs to prepare Minnesota for the public health impacts of climate change. She focuses her works on enhancing policies and plans related to the built environment, which is what we've got here, that encourage sustainability and improves public health at the same time. She serves as an adjunct professor, assistant professor at the University of Minnesota at the Department of Landscape Architecture, and has co-taught a course on sustainable site design. I'd like to recognize Kristen Robb. And again, we'll have time at the end for questions. And I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure which presentation is yours. While we're waiting for this, I'd like to recognize Councilmember Cam Gordon, who is in the audience. Thank you very much for coming. Can I do anything for you?
Okay. All right, well, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here on such an exciting event. My name again is Kristen Robb. I'm from the Minnesota Department of Health, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the climate changes. Dr. Mark Seeley did an excellent job of preparing for my presentation. I'm going to highlight a few of the things that he just talked about, and then I'm going to talk about what some of those public health impacts are, and then talk about a few of the strategies that the Minnesota Department of Health is using, and even the city of Minneapolis is using to prepare for the public health impacts. So to begin, there is a large degree of uncertainty of what these changes exactly are going to be. But we do see some trends, and Mark just did a fabulous job reviewing some of those. But again, they are, temperatures are rising, the dew points are rising, we're seeing a change in the quantity and character of rainfall, and we are seeing more storm events, and there are public health impacts for these things. So this is a slide from actually Dr. Mark Seeley that shows the average temperatures in Minnesota, and you can see that for between 1890 and 1980, there's been just a kind of a slow upward trend, about 1.6 degrees. But since the 1980s, there has been a much more dramatic increase in temperature. With the increase of temperature, there has been an increase in dew point. And it's really the dew point that we're concerned about with the public health impacts. And that is because of the heat index. And Dr. Seeley talked a little bit about this. But basically, the dew point influences how your body responds to heat. So we naturally sweat to cool off, we perspire, and when it gets more humid, it becomes much more difficult for that sweat to evaporate, to cool off. So if you look on this chart and you look at a relative humidity of 80 and the temperature is 86, it actually feels like 100 degrees. So it's really critical to look at the dew point, because as the dew point rises, the temperature can fall, but it can still feel much, much hotter. So there are many health effects from extreme heat, including heat tetany, heat rash, heat cramps. heat exhaustion, which is much more severe, heat edema, heat fainting, heat sunstroke, and death. This is another concern, especially for Minneapolis. So we have rising temperatures, we have rising humidity, and then we're in an urban heat island. This is a picture of Atlanta. This was taken in May of 1997 by NASA. And what we're seeing here is, so for 50 degrees Celsius, that's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And the daytime temperature here was 80 degrees, but some of those surfaces actually hit about 118 degrees Fahrenheit. So here's Minneapolis. This is the percent of impervious surfaces. The urban heat island effect is a measurable increase in the ambient urban air temperature, resulting primarily from the replacement of vegetation with buildings, roads, and other heat-absorbing surfaces. The heat island effect can result in significantly higher temperature differences in the urban areas versus the rural areas, and it's more noticeable at night. When we think of extreme weather events in Minnesota, we tend to think about tornadoes, floods. We don't tend to think about extreme heat, but extreme heat is very deadly and it's preventable. From 1979 to 2003, more people died in America from extreme heat than from hurricanes, lightnings, tornadoes, floods, and earthquakes combined. The 1995 Chicago heat wave caused more than 600 excess deaths. The 2003 heat wave in Europe killed over 14,000 people. And more recently, the 2010 heat wave that hit Russia caused more than 11,000 excess deaths in Moscow. So researchers are predicting that there will be higher deaths from extreme heat in the Northeast and the Midwest because we're not accustomed to this kind of high heat. Minnesotans are well equipped to deal with snowstorms and the extreme cold, but they are not well adjusted to extreme heat. And just this past summer, and Dr. Mark Seeley had mentioned this, there were 5 heat episodes in Minnesota that were worthy of issuing heat advisories or heat warnings. The worst heat event was between July 16th and 20th, and on July 19th, we hit an all-time high dew point of 82 in the Twin Cities with an approximate heat index of almost 130. So with increased heat and humidity, we may see more heat waves like this or much worse in the future. There are other possible implications of warmer temperatures. Increased temperatures and sunlight increases the rate of ozone formation on the ground level. Breathing ozone can trigger a variety of reactions, including chest pain, coughing, throat irritation, congestion, and can even worsen bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma. There's possibly going to be longer growing seasons that will increase exposure times to molds, pollens, and other alloerogens. This can exacerbate allergic, respiratory, and cardiovascular diseases, something that Dr. Seeley had mentioned. And there's going to be changes in the depth and duration of snow cover and soil and lake freezing, which will lead to increased survival rates of insects, pathogens, and other hosts. So we're also obviously interested in the change of vector-borne diseases. Climate change may influence the distribution and incidence of the endemic vector-borne diseases we have currently. Some of those diseases, tick-borne diseases, include Lyme disease, human anaplasmosis, babiosis. Mosquito-borne diseases include West Nile virus, La Crosse encephalitis virus, the Western equine encephalitis virus. And the potential for climate change to impact the range and incidence of vector-borne diseases rests really with the climatic influences on the ecology of the arthropod vectors, animal hosts, the vector-borne pathogens, and pathogen transmission cycles. For instance, as temperatures increase, the West Nile virus reproduces at higher rates, and the life cycle of vector mosquitoes accelerates, potentially leading to more human exposure to infected mosquitoes. However, it is important to recognize that there are several other factors, such as changes in land use, population density, and human behavior that can affect the distribution of disease vectors and the extent of infection. The Minnesota Department of Health monitors the endemic vector-borne diseases, but we're also monitoring for new and emerging diseases. So this is an example of some of the changes that we might see related to tick-borne diseases. Depending on the types of climate changes, though, we may see some diseases increase and other diseases decrease. For tick-borne diseases, increased temperatures may result in longer tick growing and feeding seasons, lower mortality in the winter, and the emergence of new tick species and disease agents. Increased precipitation or humidity may lead to increased black-legged tick survival and increased time available for tick feeding every day. So this is also another trend that we talked about with the increase in overall average precipitation. But the average precipitation doesn't really tell the full story, and Dr. Seeley spoke about this. Precipitation is starting to fall in heavier, more localized events. This map shows that there has been a 31% increase in the amount of heavy precipitation from 1958 to 2007. And what this map does not show is that some of these areas are being inundated with water and other areas are dry. So again, you've seen this map. This is the climate singularity that Dr. Seeley described, with some areas declared as disaster zones for floods and others for drought. So the public health impacts from floods include injuries, drowning, impaired contaminated drinking water, disruption of healthcare services, and many other issues. Floods also cause major mental health issues for people who have been affected, such as those who lose their homes or even their jobs. Additionally, there can be increased waterborne diseases and foodborne diseases. The 1993 Milwaukee cryptosporidium outbreak was the largest waterborne disease outbreak in the United States. There were many factors that contributed to this occurrence, but one of the most significant factors was the unusual weather conditions. The Milwaukee area received its heaviest rainfall in 50 years. The rainfall may have washed contaminated manure that was recently spread on the fields surrounding the area and animal feces into the receiving waters. This runoff from the rainfall clearly increased the turbidity of the water as shown in this picture. Further south from this point, the water was taken up by a water treatment plant that unsuccessfully eliminated the cryptosporidium spores from the contaminated water and then sent the water to thousands of customers. This example has significant human health impacts as well as significant costs in terms of medical costs and lost productivity. Besides increases in extreme heat events, heavy precipitation, and floods, there may be more storms and tornadoes. Minneapolis and Minnesota really needs to be prepared for multiple events, such as the tornadoes ripping through Minneapolis and then a heat wave. Some of the people who experienced the tornadoes in northeast Minneapolis that had major damage still did not have power in their homes when the heat wave in July hit. So it's important to plan for multiple events possibly occurring at the same time. MDH is particularly concerned about vulnerable populations to climate change. We're all vulnerable to certain circumstances, but a definition of vulnerability is anyone who may have difficulty adapting to rapid changes in their environment. Awareness is important, age is important, if you have biological or medical conditions, and social determinants. This is a figure that shows the increasing risk of death from heat-related, from heat events. And you can also see that it's not just the elderly that are more at risk. The very young, between 0 and 4, are also more at risk from deaths from extreme heat. So MDH has been starting to plan for the public health impacts of climate change. The department has developed a strategic plan. We're developing 4 different professional trainings on vector-borne diseases, water issues, air issues, and then basic 101, climate change and public health. We're also helping local public health plan for strategic initiatives for climate change. We're developing a toolkit to prepare for extreme heat, and we've developed a website. This is just a picture of that toolkit. It will be released in early spring. It contains several important sections that have information on risk factors for heat-related illnesses, people who are more vulnerable to the effects of heat, strategies to prevent heat-related illnesses and deaths, and a tip sheet for individuals to prevent heat-related illnesses. So we've been working with the city of Minneapolis to help the city prepare for extreme heat events. Minneapolis is only one of 2 cities that has developed a plan to prepare for extreme heat events. This is an example of a map that we prepared working with the city's health department. This map shows children who are less than 5 years old who live below the poverty line in Minneapolis with public places that have air conditioning, such as libraries, movie theaters, public parks with air conditioning, so that in a major heat event, parents can take their children to public places to cool off. So in summary, there is a large degree of uncertainty, but we're expecting temperatures to rise, dew points to rise, the quantity and quality of rainfall to change, and more severe events. And there are public health effects to all of these events. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Ooh, many, yes.
Hello. So I'm curious, when did the climate change project at the Department of Health start?
That started just a few years ago when we received a grant, a federal grant to start this work. So it's actually a very new area for the health department.
So the money comes federally, not through the state?
That's correct.
Thank you.
From the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Hello, I'm Sean Gaszewski with the Alliance for Sustainability. I'm wondering about our wonderful urban tree canopy we have and the ability of trees to help absorb stormwater and to help do evaporation to cool. And there's a lot of concern about the pests like the emerald ash borer and the Dutch elm and how that could devastate a lot of our urban trees. But then also the possibility that maybe a lot of cities are planting maples, which could also then be vulnerable to another pest. And so the necessity of having a diverse urban forest, and we're going to have a workshop on identifying elm trees in your neighborhood at our conference in ash trees in March 24th. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the benefit of the tree canopy and how to deal with that in terms of pests and the milder winters.
That's a great question for my landscape architecture hat. But we're not doing any studying on that at the health department. But I do know that the city of St. Paul is looking at that, as well as I think the city of Minneapolis. And I don't think I can make any direct recommendations other than planting a diversity of trees, just for those reasons.
I think related to that, Sean, is the understanding that with the milder winters, the less likelihood of diseases that would have died out in a cold winter, they're not dying out. The emerald ash, we thought good cold winters could slow it down. The same thing with Dutch elm and others. So it could make disease trees more prevalent and have them affect the tree canopy faster. But with the tornado pictures, it was, they took out about 8,000 trees with that tornado, and then with the devastating heat, it was really hard on that area last summer with no trees there.
And one other point I want to make, the University of Minnesota is doing a heat island study on Minneapolis right now, so there's going to be some really good information about that coming out.
Kristen, do you know if anyone in the state is studying the cost of, or the projected cost of the health impacts of climate change? And if so, can that argument be used to promote mitigation activities like transit or building sustainability and energy efficiency?
We aren't currently doing any studies on cost right now, but I do think that's an excellent suggestion and something that we should look into. Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that I was just wondering, looking at the partnership with the cooling zones for summer heat, I know with like library hours in some places are spotty, or these like movie theaters, and these are children at the poverty level. Will there be extended hours for these events? Is there an emergency plan to open these up as public cooling centers?
Right. I think the city of Minneapolis is working on that because they did recognize sometimes, for example, museums are closed on Monday, and those exact kinds of issues about hours and accessibility. And one of the reasons we were doing those types of maps was to identify where are there places that do not have those kinds of centers, and then are they open, and so looking at all of those factors. So they are looking at that. Thank you.
Yep. When you release the Extreme Heat Toolkit website in the spring, will that be available in various languages, and will people with different abilities be able to access the information? And when you do publicize the release of the website, will that be made, will it be publicized to various communities so that people will know that it does exist?
Those are all excellent suggestions, and it is not being written in any other languages right now, but that is something we should definitely look at, so I think that's a great suggestion. And we will try and do some kind of, some way of publicizing it. In fact, this is sort of a shameless plug, but we are looking for a health communicator to come on board to help us do that kind of work. So we're going to be opening a position very soon to do that. Thank you.
Do you have any tropical diseases that are coming to Minnesota that you noticed?
Not that I know of yet. We did last summer, and I am not going to remember the name of this disease, but last summer there was a very rare occurrence of an amoeba that was in one of our lakes, and someone got sick and died because of that, and I cannot remember exactly what it was, but we're looking for those kinds of things, but that could have been a sort of rare freak thing that had nothing to do with climate change, but the temperatures were definitely warmer in the lake when that happened. So we're keeping surveillance up for those kinds of issues.
How long is the funding for your office secure for? Is there an issue about whether it's going to need and get renewal funding?
Another excellent question. Actually, our grant runs about another year and a half, and then we will be definitely trying to fund ourselves again through grant writing. Hopefully, more federal funds will be available.
Another question would be, are we expecting many climate refugees from around the world, or potentially from Florida or other places where you have displaced populations? And are they thinking about long-term resettlement of climate refugees?
I do think climate refugees is a real issue. We haven't been talking seriously about that, but we are thinking about that, yeah. As an issue.
Hello? Hi, thanks for the presentation. Sidetrack, climate refugees, one really amazing documentary that was made last year by Jen Redfern is called Sun Come Up. So if you want to Google Sun Come Up, you can see it portrays the difficulties of islanders in South Pacific whose island is kind of being submerged by rising seas and all the difficulties. So see that, it's really amazing. The other question I have is, thanks again, Kristen. I'm looking at climate change mostly from a climate finance perspective, also from a global perspective, but I wanted to know, in applying what I'm doing to Minnesota, how does your office, or how would you describe the state incorporating municipalities, incorporating localities, incorporating outside of Minneapolis into your work, and how are you advancing your proposals and receiving proposals and exchanging information, things like that? Thank you.
Well, we have a partnership with the City of Minneapolis. We're extending that to the City of St. Paul, and we're also working with several rural counties. We're also trying to work across interagencies, so other department agencies, because we are only one agency among many that have a role to play in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we are partnering with the University of Minnesota, and we're a team of 2 people, so we're doing the best we can, but there's a lot of things that we're not going to get to, so it's very exciting that the City of Minneapolis is really taking a lead in doing this kind of planning, and we hope that other cities will be working together, and other counties and jurisdictions. So it's a big task, and everybody plays a part.
Across the state to localities?
I think we do have good communication. It certainly could be improved. There's always room for improvement in communication, for sure.
Hi, Shalini Gupta with the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. I was wondering if you or your office had looked at the racial disparities associated with who would be impacted most in your scenarios of health impacts?
One of the things that we are looking at, yes, are folks that might be more vulnerable to different kinds of events, and that may follow along racial lines, that may follow along other lines such as income or age. It depends really what the event is, but yes, we are looking at that. We don't really have any results yet. We're just starting to look at it. Great comment. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kristen, Rob, for that very sobering conversation of taking it down to the personal level of those that we love. Our next and final speaker, so hang in with us. Thank you very much. So we've talked about what's climate change, what its impact is. Now we're going to dig deep into Minneapolis specific. And our speaker is Brendan Slaughterback. Brendan is the Sustainability Program Coordinator that I work with in the office, and he is in fact the lead for this whole Climate Action Plan project. So for the next 12 months, your emails will all be coming from Brendan for all of his great work. He also focuses on not just Climate Action Plan, he's doing a lot of work with the city on green building, and he's also doing a lot of work on wonky performance measurement and data collection. So he's wearing many, many hats this year. Finally, he is accredited with LEED. He's an accredited professional, and he's also AICP for those of you that are in the planning world. So thank you very much, Brendan, for all your great work.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Before I move on, I just wanted to quick thank some people. Of course, Gail, our fearless leader in the sustainability office. Anders Imboden, I don't know where he ran off to, but he's also working with us on the sustainability plan and is essential in getting all this work done and everything put together for this meeting and for the next year. Also, Holly Ladd, who is our consultant on the greenhouse gas inventory, which we'll talk about, has been relentless in tracking down the data that we need to complete this work, so I could not have done it without her. So big thanks to all those people. And of course, thank you to Kristen and Mark Seeley for their wonderful presentations that really highlight how important this is. So I have 3 items that I'm going to go through here with you fairly quickly, and we'll again have a few time for a few questions at the end. I do have a brief exercise at the end to try to get some feedback from you at this meeting. I know that we don't necessarily have a final product for you to react to now, but we do want to open it up and get some feedback and conversation going in the audience. So as you probably gathered, over the next year, the City of Minneapolis will be updating our climate action plan, which will respond to greenhouse gas emission sources in the city to try and reduce them. And this effort is really in response to adopted city goals and specific targets that the city has adopted around greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The whole process will be based on a community greenhouse gas inventory. Any strategies that we come up with, we need to have a benchmark from which to work. So we'll talk a little bit later about the inventory. And the final product of all this work at the end of the year will be a recommended list of strategies from 3 areas: transportation and land use, buildings and energy, and waste and recycling, that we hope can guide our city towards those specific emissions reduction targets. Just to give you a little bit of policy background on how we got to where we are today, in 1993, the City of Minneapolis adopted one of the first climate action plans in the nation, which at the time was called the Minneapolis-St. Paul CO2 Reduction Project. In 2003, that was the first year that a greenhouse gas reduction target was actually adopted as part of the Minneapolis Sustainability Indicators. In 2005, Mayor Ryback, as Gail said, was one of the first mayors in the country to sign the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Agreement. In 2007, the Minnesota State Legislature approved and Governor Tim Pawlenty signed the Minnesota Next Generation Energy Act, which calls for specific reductions statewide in greenhouse gas emissions. In 2008, the City of Minneapolis updated their comprehensive plan, which looks at just about all the systems in the city, especially transportation and land use, and looked at how greenhouse gas can be addressed in those areas. In 2010, the City Council adopted some larger city goals and strategic directions, which include a focus on livable communities and being an eco-focused city. In 2012, the city again updated those greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, which we'll talk about here in a second. These are those targets, and these blue bars do represent the results of our community greenhouse gas emissions inventory going back to 2006. So the adopted targets of the city are a 15% reduction below 2006 levels by 2015 and a 30% reduction below 2006 levels by 2025. These targets are fairly consistent with the targets that have been adopted at the state level, similar to goals that Hennepin County has, very similar also to goals that Midwest Governor's Accord adopted. So why are we doing a plan for the City of Minneapolis? Well, first of all, as I just talked about, we want to respond specifically to those state and city adopted targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We know that the benefits of acting now, acting early, and acting strongly far outweigh what the economic consequences are going to be if we wait and have to act later or adapt to some of the changes that are going to be happening and are already happening in our climate. And you saw some of those impacts in Kristen and Dr. Seeley's presentations. We know that we can have an impact at the local level. So in the city, we can have an impact on our transportation systems, on the efficiency of our buildings, on the way we generate and process waste in our community. So we know that we can have an impact at a local level, and we should be planning to do so. We also know that this is not just about emissions reduction, but we know that climate action is going to bring a lot of co-benefits, like cleaner air and water, possibly improved health outcomes, and increasing the livability of our city. This graphic kind of gives you a framework of where the climate action plan kind of lives in the city policy. So again, the city council has adopted these kind of broad goals and strategic directions which really guide the focus of all the work in the city. And those include two specifically about being eco-focused and being a livable, healthy community. The city has also adopted specific sustainability indicators, and we have 26 indicators that we track on an annual basis to figure out how is the city doing in all these areas of sustainability. And you can find all those on our website. But one of those specific indicators is about community-wide greenhouse gas emissions levels. So the Climate Action Plan is really a tool to help us respond to that specific indicator and that specific target for community-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And the plan will do three things. It will measure the impact of the strategies that we're already undertaking. So some of the efforts that the city is already engaged in, we want to figure out where are those going to take us in terms of our emissions levels. It will engage the community. Like we're doing tonight, we want to start a conversation in the community about climate action, some of the potential impacts and what those strategies can be to reduce emissions, and eventually prioritizing specific strategies that the plan will recommend to our decision makers to help us get there. And you'll see the orange box on the lower right. The plan is not the end of the process. The plan is really a roadmap to get us to those targets, but any specific strategy or policy recommendation that's contained in the plan is obviously going to take some implementation, some further conversation by community members, and of course further conversation by our elected officials to actually adopt and implement. And then finally, we want to continue to measure our progress. We want to continue to look back at our emissions level going down? What kind of impact are these strategies having? So we'll be continuing to look back even after the plan is over. We feel that stakeholder input and community input to this process is really critical because community stakeholders have very specific expertise about their property, about their experience in the city, about their ownership of a business, about how they interact with energy and transportation and all these systems. So we want to tap into that to find out what strategies are going to work best for the community. We know also that the city, with a big C, doesn't control all the policy levers that impact greenhouse gas emissions in our city. So part of this process includes reaching out to folks in other levels of government and other agencies like Hennepin County, Metropolitan Council, the state of Minnesota, MnDOT, the University of Minnesota, to bring them into the process and say, this is our target. A lot of them have similar targets. How can we work together to work in Minneapolis? We also know that we're not going to be able to do this by ourselves in city government. We want to build partnerships for implementing this plan across the community. So not all these strategies are necessarily going to be things that city government does. They might be things that community groups do or neighborhoods do to address emissions. So another way that we're trying to incorporate input and develop this plan, over the course of the next year, we'll be using a system of working groups and a steering committee to develop these specific strategies for how we're going to reach our targets. And again, those three working groups are going to be in these areas where you'll see most of our emissions come from. And that's buildings and energy, transportation and land use, and waste and recycling. And those groups, to form those groups, we reached out to our citizen representatives, so our Minneapolis Citizens Environmental Advisory Committee, our government partners, business groups like the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce and building owners and managers, again, other governmental agencies, to try to build groups that can really help us develop the best strategies. Those groups will eventually forward that work onto a steering committee, which will be composed of similar stakeholders. A lot of the working group members will serve on that group as well, to eventually forward some final recommendations on to our elected policymakers. So what are the outcomes of this process? What do we hope to achieve by the end of 2012? We want a list of the very best strategies that these working groups can come up with to meet our emissions reduction targets, prioritized or looked at through the lens of not just emissions reduction, but also what's the relative costs of these things, what's the community support for any individual strategy, how easy or hard is it going to be to implement the strategy, and then looking a little bit at some of those other co-benefits. If we do X strategy, is it going to have a really good health impact, or is it going to have a really good air quality impact, or is it going to have some other impact that makes it valuable? Again, we hope to have that all forwarded to our City Council for review in late 2012. And again, implementation of any of these specific strategies is going to require additional review and approval by the City Council and, of course, additional stakeholder input. So how can you be involved in the process? First of all, thank you for showing up tonight and spending 2 hours on a weekday during dinner time to hear us talk about this stuff. That's one way you can be engaged. You can also request a presentation for your group or organization if you have a neighborhood organization or a specific group that meets regularly in Minneapolis that you'd like to hear more about the Climate Action Plan. We can bring a presentation to you similar to this to talk about what we're trying to do and gather some feedback from your group about what your group's strategies, what you think would be the best strategies. You can respond to our survey. We have a survey up on our website that has a lot of space for you to leave your feedback and ask you some questions about energy efficiency and transportation. You can just email us directly, and we'll have contact information up here in a second. We'll have a number of workshops scheduled during the process that'll be similar to this, maybe not as much talking at you and more time for you to talk at us to get your feedback. And of course, there'll be a comment period when the document is actually developed. So here are 2 important pieces if you want to get in touch with us or stay informed during the process. You can email us at sustainability@minneapolismn.gov, or you can go to the Minneapolis City website /sustainability/climate. So that's an overview of the process. I wanted to give you a brief update on our community greenhouse gas inventory, which we are just kind of wrapping up right now. And it's important to talk about this because we can't really understand if we're going to hit our targets or what impacts our strategies are going to have if we don't know where we're starting from. So the inventory really provides that baseline of where are we at and where are the different gases coming from. So there is a sort of a general consensus nationwide about how you say what a community's impact is on greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not set in stone, and there actually isn't one adopted standard. But we're in general agreement. We've looked at many of the cities, and there are 140 cities nationwide that have adopted a climate action plan, but we've looked at a lot of them, and we think we have an inventory process that is very similar to most of them. So some of the things it does include are things like our use of electricity and natural gas, vehicle transportation that's happening in our city, some point sources of greenhouse gas emissions, other transportation traffic like rail and barge traffic and airport operations. The wastewater that we use has a greenhouse gas emissions impact, and then the processing and disposal of the solid waste that we generate. Some of the things it does not include are, and we want to be open about this, are products that we consume in our community but may be produced elsewhere and create emissions in other states, other countries. Any of the emissions from extracting or refining or transporting the fuel that's used to generate our energy. So we get our electricity from coal and natural gas and wind, and so the upstream extraction of those natural resources are not included in this inventory. The portion of vehicle travel that's coming into Minneapolis or going out of Minneapolis but that occurs outside of our boundaries, excuse me, that's not part of this inventory. There are also some other small industrial process emissions that aren't included. I'll get your question at the end when we have the microphone. Thanks for waiting. So this is an overview of our emissions inventory that we updated going back to 2006 and up to 2010. So again, 2006 is our baseline year that we're using for targets for 2015 and 2030, and you'll see those on the line there. And the three largest areas there in tan and brown and pink are the consumption of electricity, the road transportation that's happening in our community, and the natural gas consumption that's happening in our community. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on some of these categories. This chart represents our electricity consumption in the city in megawatt hours, so actually how much electricity are we using as a community. You can see that the consumption of electricity has actually remained fairly flat since 2006. We're using about the same amount of electricity as we did in 2006. But if you look at the amount of greenhouse gas pollution that's coming from the electricity that we produce, which is in the yellow bars here, you'll see that's decreased fairly significantly since 2006. And that's because, partly because of state mandates and other improvements Xcel is making, we are getting more of our power from sources that have a lower greenhouse gas impact. So we're switching, Xcel has been switching some coal plants to natural gas-fired power plants, and it's also been adding more renewable energy to its mix. This is our natural gas consumption as a city, so how many units, and natural gas is often measured in therms, so how many therms of natural gas are we using in the city? And you can see we are using less in 2010 than we were in 2006, about 16% less. This is a breakdown of the transportation activity, road transportation activity that's happening in our community from 2006. So again, here too, you can see that it's stayed fairly flat since 2006. We know that there are some other factors that affect our emissions in our community. We want to be aware of what those are and understand how they're going to impact us in the future. Our population, if you look at census and Met Council estimates, has gone down just a little bit since 2006, down 1.5% since 2006. Since 2000, our population's remained actually fairly flat according to the census. But our per capita or per person emissions of greenhouse gas has gone down about 16% since 2006. So while the number of people in the city is about the same, the emissions have gone down. And there could be a lot of reasons for that, some of which I'll touch on here in a minute. So overall, we know that total emissions are down 15% from 2006, around 15%. We're actually just about there, using the inventory process that I described. And primarily, that's because our electricity is getting cleaner and we're using less natural gas in our community. Again, our per person emissions are down about 16% from 2006. We also know that there's been a major national, international event since 2006, and that's a significant economic downturn, which has had a lot of negative impacts on our community and communities across the country. So we think, and we're trying to figure this out in a little more detail, there's certainly been some impact on natural gas or electricity usage, for example, from that economic downturn. We've lost about 4.5% of the jobs that were in the city of Minneapolis since 2006, according to the Department of Employment and Economic Development. So buildings that are vacant or have their thermostats turned down, or maybe industrial processes that have been shut down, people maybe not driving as much in the community, that has an impact. So obviously we want to see a reverse of the employment trends in our community, but we need to understand how that impacts our greenhouse gas emissions and how we're going to address those two things simultaneously. We also know that we might not see a lot of cleaner electricity coming onto the grid in the near future. So Xcel has made a lot of great improvements, but we don't know if that trend is, we think it's probably not likely that that trend is going to continue on the same line for the next 5 or 10 years. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what that might look like as well. So we might not be able to count on that as something that's going to reduce our impact in the future. And of course, as I talked about, we know that more jobs and more activity in the city is great, is good, and we want it. but it also might mean increased energy use. So the next steps in this process, we're going to be finalizing that community greenhouse gas report, which is going to have a lot more detail than I presented here, and that's going to be released in the next few weeks to a month. We talked about those 3 working groups. We want to start convening those groups to work on strategies in the next month here. Some of those folks are here today. If you see someone with a little WG or SC on their name tag, some of those folks have been able to join us tonight, and we thank you very much for attending and being willing to be part of that process, and we want to get that started soon here. And we also want to begin some of those other outreach activities. So if there are groups specifically that want outreach, the presentation that I talked about, to talk about the climate action plan at their group, to come to them, we'd like to start doing that. So let me just talk about the little exercise I've got first, and then if there are a few questions, I can take those questions. But I want to get this out so people can start thinking and writing while questions are going on. All of you should have received 2 pieces of colored paper, sticky notes, and we just want to kind of open the conversation tonight to start this plan off, and think about these 2 questions on your blue and green sticky notes. What do you think is the greatest risk posed by climate change in Minneapolis? And what do you think is the greatest opportunity to address it? So they're very open-ended questions. There's no rules for these. You can write whatever you want. There's going to be some places on the wall as you walk out of the auditorium where we'll have those questions printed out large. When you've written it down, go stick it on the wall, and we'd like to take all those responses to our working groups.
Not everybody got some of those.
Okay. As you walk out, we've got Anders and Gail here. They've got the paper and can supply you with sticky notes. We don't want anyone to be without sticky notes. Now I'd be happy to answer some questions too about the process or the inventory. We've lost our microphones here. Sean, yeah.
Well, just wanted to say that it's going to be great to have you guys having one of your first workshops. We'll be at our Sustainable Communities Conference on March 24th at Hennepin Avenue Methodist. That's on a Saturday. So we'll have a workshop as part of that conference. We'll be looking at our footprint in 1940, 2010, and where we want to be in 2030. The other question would be, with the working groups, I think those 3 topics are great. Is there an opportunity to have a kind of a transparency of the process so that those who can't go to working group meetings could maybe see like what they come up with ahead of time on the web and offer feedback, or maybe even like publicize when they're meetings so people could come and listen in?
That's a good point.
And then the other 3rd topic is, could there be a part of the report that would actually discuss what the UN scientists recommend in terms of what our carbon reduction should be, in terms of by when? Because a lot of them are talking about tipping points that are happening much sooner, and so they would like to actually see more rapid reductions. And maybe you could have a part of the plan that could actually describe what the actual goal should be if we were following the UN scientists.
I'll work backwards. As far as the goal is concerned, I think it would be valuable to talk about what the scientific consensus is on what we need to do in the report. The process will, and I think you understand, will respond to that city goal about greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but I think it would be valuable to include that in the report. Your other question about transparency, all the working group meetings and steering committee meetings will be public meetings, and so anybody is welcome to come. We'll put the dates on the website that we posted, and the outcomes of those. So what the groups are developing. So people want to send in comments on those. Ken?
Brennan, first thanks for your work and everyone else in the city that's put this together. I know it's not easy because there's, not everybody is, I'm sure, as cooperative or as helpful as you would like, and it's challenging to figure out all the data to come up with the numbers. From looking at the chart, it's obvious that electricity is a significant part of it, natural gas, so CenterPoint and Xcel Energy, and then transportation's the third. It looks like Obama's done some things in transportation that are going to have some impact on that, and then as well, we can do more at the local level. But how supportive has Xcel Energy and CenterPoint been of looking at where they can help with these reductions, and what are your expectations for their help?
Well, Xcel and CenterPoint are both sitting on our working groups, so they've been very forthcoming with all the data that we've been using to develop it here. So obviously there are lots of higher level issues at the state level about, at Public Utilities Commission, and the city of Minneapolis can influence that and be part of that discussion, but isn't always the final say. But at the local level, I think they've been very forthcoming with data, and we hope that they're definitely active participants in the working groups to understand what community residents want, and understand what they can provide from a utility side. So they're participating because we think having them participate is better than having them outside the process. Got one up here, or right here? Yep.
I'm curious about the reality of actually implementing really aggressive climate change policies in the city when it comes to these steering groups. I mean, I work in the city, and so I understand the steering groups, even the bureaucracy that moves about as fast as the Titanic heading for an iceberg. And so I'm curious about if there is, what is the possibility, especially with the budgetary problems in the city right now, cuts to LGA on the state and the larger level. What's the reality of putting aggressive greenhouse gas reduction, other climate change, such as the redesign the forest canopy, the urban canopy, I guess, in Minneapolis and.
That's a heck of a question. Yeah. I mean, we've heard from the mayor here today. We have at least one council member here, but these targets that we have here are not set by staff. These are set by your elected officials. So they are obviously have bought into the targets here. What the groups come up with in terms of strategies, I think, is part of the process. And obviously, we want to select strategies that are the most cost-effective, the easiest to implement, and can actually get us to our targets. So part of the process is exploring how we can get there. So I guess I'm sort of in a long-winded way saying I don't know the answer to your question, but that's kind of part of what you can do as a resident is just provide your input and keep monitoring how the process is going. Right here in the front.
Minneapolis has an extensive park system, and it's unusual though because it's not managed by a city department. What role will the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board play in climate change plan?
We'll be including them kind of as consulting them regularly throughout the process to figure out a lot of their strategies are directly related, like urban tree canopy and effects on water quality and things like that. So we have pretty regular conversations at our Citizens Environmental Advisory Committee and at a staff level with Park Board staff. So, but your point is valid. They do have a little bit separate governance structure. So this is this is a City of Minneapolis effort, and they're, I think, very interested in this, and so we'll be consulting them along the way.
But will you have the authority to impose anything on them? I mean, what if there's conflict?
I think if the strategies that are developed, if there's conflict, then that will have to be something that is worked out at the elected official level.
And they have their own green strategies anyway. They have a report on their Minneapolis Park website. They're doing a lot with events going green.
But to piggyback on a comment made back there, they're a huge bureaucracy as well.
They're actually very faster than the city, I think.
So
This gentleman's been waiting. Yeah.
I wanted to comment. I used to live in Ames, Iowa. One of the things that I liked about Ames was they had a municipal utility. So I sat in a city council meeting where the city council directed the utility to increase the amount of renewable energy. The result of that was the city of Ames bought 30 megawatts of a nearby wind farm, which is about 30% of the peak electrical capacity of the city of Ames. And I've been following lots of electrical power issues for a long time. My background is electrical engineering. I built a solar-powered vehicle when I was in college at Iowa State. The biggest problem I can see with doing anything is electricity and natural gas. Those are both regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. Have we had any dialogue with the Public Utilities Commission is the first question. The second question would be, well, the only way I can think of that we can actually include Excel in an aggressive reduction strategy would be to municipalize the electric grid and turn around and contract it back to Excel to operate. And that way, the city would determine what the electric rates are and what the electrical generation mix was. And then we would not be constrained by public utilities regulations that say you have to offer the same thing to everyone in the entire state, which I believe was one of the fundamental problems why I think it was Boulder, maybe? Boulder wanted to have more green electricity, lower carbon footprint. The Public Utilities Commission said you can't offer it to Boulder and not offer it to everyone else, which resulted in, I don't know what, depending on your position, it's either a fiasco, it was probably a fiasco either way, but this is a problem. How are we going to address that? Because that's 50 to 70% of the carbon footprint is determined by what the Utilities Commission regulation rules are, or unless we're going to choose to pick some other method, we can come up with our own rules.
Well, excuse me. Just so you know, we are including members of the state Minnesota Pollution Control Agency in our process. I think that might be a strategy that comes out. The Pollution Control Agency, not the.
No, he was talking about the public utilities.
Yeah, I know, and I'm just saying.
Okay.
The PUC at this time is not in the group, but I can't or cannot say that municipalization of the utility will be a recommendation. It's very complicated recommendation, but if there are resident input on that, you're welcome to send it to us, and we can pass that on. Any other questions way in the back there?
Carbon generation associated with producing these fuels and refining them, I think it's very troubling to me. And this is something we're measuring. This is something that's going to drive policy, and we're not looking at something that's extraordinarily impactful. So I'm very troubled that these upstream costs aren't being considered.
Excuse me. Yeah, we do recognize that we're not including the upstream emissions from all the fuel sources that generate our energy. When you get into the accounting methods that are required to accurately calculate all the upstream emissions from generating our energy, it's extremely complicated. I know the issue around the type of fuel that's going into our transportation system, but transportation strategies, whether we calculate that upstream emissions or not, transportation strategies are going to have the same impact. If we're increasing bicycle mode share, increasing transit mode share, it's difficult to measure all the upstream emissions. We might be able to try that in a few years when the accounting methods are better for a citywide level like this. But we can certainly have those discussions at the working group level and realize that there may be some impacts here that aren't totally reflected in the number, but are, again, some of those co-benefits that we were talking about, that we want to recognize, even if we can't measure something, there are some co-benefits to some of these strategies. So it's a good point. Okay, one more question, and then we want to make sure everyone has time to put your sticky notes up. Yes, in the center. No, they're not mostly businesses. We have representation from the business community, but we're including other folks like nonprofits, environmental organizations, representation from our Citizens Environmental Advisory Committee. But we understand that folks who manage buildings really know a lot about their energy use, and so we want to make sure all those groups are in the process. How were those people picked out? Well, we looked at models from lots of other cities to see what's the composition of these groups, and we know that there's lots of interest in serving on these groups, but again, we tried to look to our citizen group to provide some input. We tried to look to technical experts. We tried to talk to our representatives and see what folks might work the best. So we're trying to come up with a model that brings in all those groups.
And they're still all going to be public meetings if you weren't in a working group and you're interested. So I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it short. I promised we'd get people out of here by 8 o'clock. Can we?
Historically in Minneapolis had real impacts on communities of color. And I just am wondering how the working groups and the steering committee are really going to institutionalize the equity analysis into their work so that these inequities aren't further entrenched as these strategies are developed. I think it's a really critical question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and we've had specific conversations about this, and we're trying to talk about right now what's the very best way to get all that representation. We're also working with folks like Kristen at the Department of Public Health to understand how are these impacts going to be felt differently across different communities across the city. But through these methods and through the working groups, which as we've talked about, we're trying to finalize, we want to get that input. So this is part of the process, and we want to hear about it. So, thank you.
Thank you. When you walk outside is where you put your stickies, so please do that. Congratulations.
Thanks. Good, right?
Yeah.
Better than, yeah.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you very, very much, Dr.